Dear loved ones in Christ Jesus, last week we looked at the number 4. 4 horsemen and the first 4 seals, which show us what to expect to the second coming of Christ. This week we look at the 5th and 6th seal. And the number we focus on today is 2. This sermon is titled 2 Cries and A Lamb. It is because of Christ, the Lamb, mankind is divided into 2 groups, those in Christ and those outside of Christ. It's because of Christ we see 2 different cries in our passage. One cry is for God's justice to come, and one cry is for God's justice to not come. And so let's come to our first point in verse 9, looking at the first cry, the cry of the faithful saints. We look at their bold cry. Now in verse 9, we come to the 5th seal opened. And John saw an altar, and underneath were souls of Christians, martyrs who died for their faith. Of course, this altar does not represent a sacrifice for sin, for that has been once and for all offered by Christ. Nevertheless, a believer is said to give himself as a sacrifice. Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Sacrifice does not just mean a sacrifice for sin, but it means devotion to God, giving yourself. Our lives belong to Christ. We give our lives to serve Him, and some believers indeed die for their service. This is what we read here. Also in the Old Testament altar, the blood of the sacrifice was poured at the bottom of the altar. And this blood of the sacrifice represents life. And so this is the image here. The believer has offered his life to God. And Apostle Paul says in 2 Timothy 4 verse 6, "For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand." And this offering of your life follows Christ. Christ, Ephesians 5 verse 2 says that Christ's perfect life and his sacrificial death was a sweet-smelling savor to God. And so this sweet smell of a life offered to God relates to the altar of incense that you remember in the Old Testament. And this altar of incense mentioned in the Old Testament is often mentioned in Revelation. Revelation 8 verse 3. An angel went to the altar and offered incense with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. So this is what we have here. Believers who have died faithfully but are now brought near to God. And here they're crying out to Him. They were slain just like Christ, the Lamb, was slain. We read that in chapter 5. And this is true discipleship. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus, even if it means dying faithfully, just like He did for us. And this vision of the martyrs, the saints crying out, relates to the whole period before the second coming. These are the cries all over history. The cries of those who have died because of whatever religious or political power that oppressed them, persecuted them because of their faith. In context here, the Romans had Christians crucified, burned, and fed them to dogs. And moving on in verse 10, we hear their loud and bold cries. They wanted justice because of what they had suffered. It says here, "Dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on earth?" But folks, this is not a personal vengeance. This is not a personal vengeance. Nor were they simply commanding God, God, you saw what they did to us. You better do something about it and make our enemies pay. No, it's not a personal vengeance. Here we notice that there is an element of worship and honoring God in their cry. There's an element of worship here. Notice how they describe God, firstly. The holy and true God. He is holy and hates sin and injustice. And He is true, He is trustworthy. He is the Father who hears the cries of the righteous. Can you see that element of worship here in verse 10? Second, they cried out, "Dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them?" Children, remember the parable of the persistent widow in Luke 18, who kept asking and asking for justice. And the lesson of that parable was, "And shall not God avenge His own elect who cry day and night unto Him?" The saints here are glorifying the God who listens to His people and works out justice. Elsewhere in Genesis 4 verse 10, God told Cain, who had killed Abel, He told Cain, "The voice of Abel's blood is crying out to me." And so here, the believers are not asserting their rights, demanding things simply, but they want God to assert His kingdom. Christ has redeemed these precious believers with His blood. They are precious because of Christ. And yet, the enemies slaughtered them just like Jesus. And so they cry out, "How long, O Lord?" Elsewhere in Psalm 79 verse 10, the psalmist laments to God. The nations say to Israel, "Where is their God? Where is your God?" And so the psalmist says, "God, let God be known among the nations. Let God be known among the nations." How? By the revenging of the blood of thy servants, which is shed. So this is a cry to God. God, do not prolong your silence, because your silence makes the enemies think that you are not there. Lord, make yourself known to the earth. God declares His glory by creation. He declares His mercy by the gospel. And the saints here want God to declare His justice by judging the wicked. They are clinging to that promise of God where He says, "Vengeance is mine, I shall repay." Those are God's words. The world is in imbalance, unbalance. The righteous suffer, and the unrighteous prosper. And so the saints here call upon God to balance all things out. God let the enemies know that these lives that they took away, these lives belong to you. Let the world know. Now here, we can have some application. We can learn a lot about the topic of martyrdom. Martyrs are the believers dying for their faith. Now first we might ask, how does this dying for the faith apply to Singaporean Christians? Some might say such threats of dying for your faith for Singaporeans seem so far away. Well, first, we cannot take for granted that peace and tolerance towards our faith will last forever. Conceivably, in 50 years' time, this passage may be preached on this pulpit with much more direct relevance than today. Maybe we may not face persecution in our generation, but our kids may. The children sitting beside you may. Our grandkids, they have not yet come. So let us take heed to be rooted in our faith, to have revelation always in the back of our minds. And while we live day by day in this peaceful time, let us not forget the general principle. There is a general principle. Whether you die for your faith or not, your lives must be lived for God every day. At the end of verse 9, you see the words, the testimony they held. This is not talking about a one-time verbal testimony, but this is a testimony, a gospel witness that's shown by your life. In our passage here, the enemies of the gospel must have taught that the believers that they killed were foolish. Not just wrong, but they were foolish. These Christians, willing to die for their faith and not willing to deny their faith to save their lives, what foolishness. Willing to die because of a crucified man, what foolishness. Likewise, whether we die for our faith or not, brethren, we live out this foolish faith before the world. We resist all pressures to deny God, whether in public or in private. Sure, tomorrow you may not have someone pointing a gun to your head, asking you to deny Christ. But you may have your own sins calling you to deny God. So let us not think our passage here is so radical, so out of this world that it has no application for us. Let us not think, wow, Revelation 6, give up our lives for Jesus. That's such a far-fetched idea. Well, this idea of giving up your life for Jesus is always close to the Bible. Mark 8, 34-35, Jesus says, whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's shall save it. Whether or not you literally give up your life for Jesus and dying for the faith, all of us must give our lives to Jesus. Let us we give our lives by shaping our lives according to His Word and His will for us, and denying ungodly pleasures. The faithful saints who died here, they did not cling unto their lives as something so precious that they would deny Jesus to save their lives. So likewise, we must have a low view of our lives for the sake of discipleship, for the sake of following Jesus. Perhaps our direct calling now is not to die for our faith in Singapore, for now. But our calling is to live a life that glorifies God in this society. The Apostle John himself in 1 John 3:16 says, hereby perceive we the love of God, because He laid down His life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. You may not be called to give your lives to the enemies for the sake of the gospel now, but you are always called to give your life to your brethren, giving yourself to one another. And another application here is the boldness of the saints. Here they were, in a way, making a request to God. God, will you not do this? You may be thinking, oh, these saints are so bold here to request God to do this and that. But remember, we are to do the same on earth. Hebrews 4:16, we are to boldly go to the throne of grace. And that's what we see here as well. That boldness to cry out to God for what is necessary. And why can we be bold? Because of Christ. Because of Christ. Because we come in Christ, and also we are praying for God's promises to be fulfilled. Not for our own glory, but for His glory, like what we read here. That's why we can be bold in our prayers. And lastly, let us not forget that this is the fifth seal. This means that the end of the world progresses with the deaths of the martyrs and their cries. And the final judgment comes as a response to all these cries to justice, for justice. And so this is how world history will look like, with the death of precious saints for their faith. And so just like last week, our passage here helps us to have a realistic view of the world. This world is under judgment. This is a world that can and does kill Christians. It sobers us up to not love this world. Now, moving on. The saints cried out to God. But what was the response to this cry? We come to the next point, a delayed fulfillment. In verse 11, a white robe was given to them. This was a vindication to declare that indeed they were righteous, washed in the blood of Christ. A vindication to say that the world was foolish to kill such believers who belong to God. And this white robe is also a sign of faithfulness, that they have indeed lived their lives for Christ. They have overcome pressures to deny their faith. They are victorious. You know, in church history, there may be unknown martyrs in the remotest places of the world who died for their faith. And church history does not even know their names. But it doesn't matter whether we know the names of martyrs or not, for God knows their names. They are known of God. They died on earth. They were despised on earth. They were seen by the world as losers, dying for a crucified man. But here they are, with the white robes, being honored in heaven by God. And that's all that matters. That's all that matters. What seems like the most unglorious death on earth was actually a passageway to glory, eternal glory in heaven. But thinking about the white robe again, let us remember that martyrs are sinners. Those who died for their faith, they are sinners. They need the blood of the Lamb just like any other believer. They are not special believers. And so this white robe symbolizes the righteousness of Christ, the most precious thing to a believer. You know, some have noted that the most recited psalm of those who died during the Reformation, you know what was the most common psalm recited by those on their way to death? It was Psalm 51. Psalm 51. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. This was the cry of the martyrs in their last moments. And here indeed in glory, they were having those washed white robes, washed by the blood of Christ. White as snow. And further in our verse 11, after being dressed, God says to them, they are now to rest. And this is a language of blessing. To enjoy the rest from their labors. To rest away from the cursed world that killed them. Rest. However, what they desired, which was justice on earth, what they desired was not to happen yet. So there is a delayed fulfillment. For now they were to rest for a little season. A little season. Now this sounds like a short time, little season. But remember that the Bible often uses such words to describe what is actually a long time. You may have come across in the Bible the term, the last days. The last days. And these last days actually refer to the period till the return of Christ, which actually years. And so there must be patience, even for the saints in heaven. In chapter 5, we saw how both the saints in heaven and the saints on earth must worship God. Likewise, here, both saints in heaven and on earth must be patient as we await God's purposes to come to pass. And they were told to wait. They were told to have this patience because God states at the end of verse 11, there will be other martyrs, other faithful saints who will die just like you did. The whole of human history shall have martyrs along the way in different parts of the world in different times. And this all serves God's purposes for the witness of the gospel across the land. It seems that often, whenever Christianity rises up in a place, there are martyrs. Think of Stephen in the book of Acts. The rise of the church, yet there was the martyr Stephen in Acts 7. And we can note the many martyrs in the early church, or even in more recent history, the martyrs in the Middle East or Africa. The blood of the martyrs is a positive sign that Christ has a kingdom of faithful servants willing to die for the gospel. This is God's work. This is God's kingdom. But the blood of the saints here is also a negative, visible sign to unbelievers. For this blood that you have spilled is a sign of your hatred for Christ. Matthew 10, verse 34, Jesus says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." The gospel stirs up the world. Not just believers, but also unbelievers. The gospel changes world history. The gospel stirs up the world. And this involves killing of faithful believers. This is the fifth seal, the death of martyrs and their cries. The kingdom grows, but so does the hatred towards the kingdom. But I want us to see also, verse 11 has a note of comfort. Can you see it? There is this comfort that the death of saints is used to fulfill the plans of God. The death of saints is not a strange and random thing, just like how the death of Christ is not something random. The death of his people is something that God uses for his purposes. So indeed, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. And so from this verse 11, with one application, we can learn the importance of patience. The importance of patience from verse 11. You know, when you read the prophets or in many places, often the prophet laments at the situation. Why does this happen? But then God says there is a timing for his plan. So be patient. And this book of Revelation follows the call to patience. Now you notice that the book of Revelation often tells us what to expect, but it never tells us exactly how long more. When is the exact date of this or that? Why does this happen? Or to put it another way, the book of Revelation often tells us of the what without telling us of the exact when or why. But that is what faith and obedience accomplishes. Faith and obedience clings unto what God has revealed without demanding all the details. Submitting to God in all things. Faith is trusting in the God who does all things for his pleasure and his glory. We now transition to the sixth seal in verse 12. And this is the second cry of our sermon, the cry of the desperate wicked. And what we have from verse 12 onwards is the time as we come to the final judgment in the future. You know, in later chapters, we will also see other visions of the final judgment. So what we have here is just one of many perspectives of the final judgment. And here we have a very vivid description of what to expect before Christ returns. As someone said, you know, what we read just now, all the prayers, all the deaths of believers that we just read are like water pushing against a dam. And at the right time, God opens the gate and his judgment flows out. And this is what we read here in verse 12 onwards. In verse 12 to verse 14, these are great signs that you also read in the prophets and also in the gospel in Matthew 24. These are signs that show that the day of the Lord is come. The day of the Lord is a concept you find in the Old and the New Testament. For example, Joel 2 verse 31, it says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood," similar to our passage, "before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." Joel 2 verse 31. And this is what we have here. And the day of the Lord can be described as the day where God visits the world. God visits the world on this day. And this day is a terrifying day for the wicked, for judgment comes upon them. But this day of the Lord is a comforting day for the saints, for the righteous, for God is visiting this world to save them from this world. Looking at all these signs in verse 12 to 14, we do see a small preview of these things in the world, don't we? Earthquakes. We know that other countries suffer all these things. Earthquakes, lunar eclipses, meteors. But of course, our passage speaks of the height of such natural occurrences where people, as they see all these things, will be driven to fear. Verse 15, many will be driven to hide because they witness these things happening. In this world that we live in, there is an order. The sun rises and sets. There are 4 seasons in other places. After rain, there is sunshine. But this picture shows chaos. Chaos. It shows what happens when the righteous Creator God who orders the world now shows anger toward the world. It's similar to the plagues in Egypt in Exodus. Verse 14 says that the skies separated like a scroll. Reminds us of Matthew 3, where, remember, Jesus was baptized and the heavens opened. And God says, "This is my beloved Son." But here it is different. The sky opens because the wicked are going to behold Jesus coming as the judge. At the end of verse 14, the mountains were moved out of their places. Mountains are often seen as the most enduring of all of God's creations. Mountains are still standing after many years of human history. But even they are shaken here as God visits the world. Now, those in KS, yesterday you studied Nahum chapter 1. Nahum chapter 1 verse 5 says, "The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence." Now, all these are signs of judgment. God is visiting the world. And we come to verse 15, where I want to talk about our sub-point in the bulletin. A hopeful dream. The second last point in our outline. A hopeful dream. Why am I talking about a hopeful dream here? First, let us understand the people in verse 15. The point here is that we find a whole range of people, from kings to slaves. The point is that God's judgment falls upon all kinds of sinners, for all have sinned. And they altogether hid themselves during these events. No doubt a desperate reaction. What else could they do? But they had a hopeful dream in this nightmare. Verse 16. They cried out to the mountains to fall on them so that they can hide from God, from the wrath of the Lamb. Now this is a foolish dream, a foolish wish. Recall that the mountains moved in verse 14 because of God. They serve God and not man. But here the sinner cries out to creation to save them from the Creator who has come to judge. The sinners cry out to creation to save them from the Creator. Now, is this not a picture of idolatry? Even in the last moments of life on earth, sinners still cling onto creation as their hope. It's a hopeful dream that creation somehow provides security from the Creator Judge. This reminds us of Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve sinned and they hid themselves from God. They thought that they could hide from God. So sin brings such foolishness and blindness. It allows sinners to dream away the reality of divine judgment. Just like in the days of Noah, people turned a blind ear to Noah's preaching. They turned a blind eye to that big boat that Noah was building. Noah, why are you building a boat, such a big boat on dry land? But when the flood came, it was too late. The door was closed. In our passage, it was too late. They tried finding a refuge from God's wrath. No, unbelievers do spend time and money traveling to see great mountains. They do spend time and resources to experience God's beautiful creation. But it's so tragic and ironic that this life of enjoying God's creation ends by wanting God's creation to kill them so that they do not have to face the Creator. They called on the mountains to fall on them. Even death is better than facing the wrath of the Lamb. Of course, this is foolishness. For death does not mean the end of reality, but death for the unbeliever means the start of an eternal reality in hell. Those who hate God, those who hate the faithful church, will face the wrath of the Lamb. Come to our last point, a fearful reality away from the hopeful dream. The fearful reality is that Christ will pour out his wrath on sinners. Unbelievers face wrath for their sins. They face wrath for persecuting the church, for mocking the gospel, for rejecting the gospel. The glory of the gospel, the good news, that the Son of God dies for sinners, is often mocked by the world, rejected. Yes, even the rejection of the gospel deserves wrath. John 3:36, he that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life, and he that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. In verse 17, they cry out, who shall be able to stand? This is a human reaction to what was going on. Who can stand when the world collapses? But that's a question we must ask. Can any sinner stand when God visits the world in judgment? Can any sinner hope to stand? Yes, those washed by the blood of the Lamb. Remember my introduction. Because of the Lamb, there are two groups of people in history. Those safe in the Lamb, and those outside of the Lamb who will face his wrath. Psalm 130, verse 3 says, if thou, Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, if you keep track of sins, who shall stand? Who shall stand? Verse 4, but there is forgiveness with thee. There is forgiveness to be found in the God who judges by the blood of the Lamb. Last week, I used the book of Habakkuk as a conclusion. Today, I want to bring in some of Nahum, the minor prophet. And again, you would notice that the book of Revelation reuses many pictures in the prophets to show the final judgment. Now, let me read Nahum chapter 1, verse 5 to 7. It says, the mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence, yea, the world and all that dwell therein. Who can stand before his indignation? And who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? Who shall stand? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. God will pour out his wrath. But, Nahum 1 verse 9, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. Verse 17 asks the questions, who shall stand? Those who trust in him. Those who trust in the Lamb shall stand in that day of judgment, in the day where there is no peace to be found. Now, to all of us here right now, as we conclude, here we are experiencing a peaceful morning in peaceful Singapore on this wonderful, beautiful Sunday morning. Yes, we read the news, other parts of the world are not experiencing the peace that we are facing now. But here we are, experiencing a peaceful morning in peaceful Singapore. But this peace does not matter if you do not have peace with God. That's the only thing that matters, and that's the only peace that we must seek above all. And so while there is still time, dear sinner, you must ensure you have embraced the terms of peace by the blood of the Lamb, that forgiveness is found in him and him alone. Find peace in the wrath of in the Lamb. And if you delay, you would face his wrath. The same Lamb who offers peace right now, the same Lamb that will pour out his wrath. And in this time before he returns, he still brings the gospel of peace to sinners. Even right now, he has his servants preaching the gospel of peace. But he will come one day, and you will either face him naked in your sin, or you'll face him knowing that you have trusted in him. Knowing that you're clothed with his righteousness, you're washed with the blood of the Lamb that has come. And you face him knowing that you are his people, and that he is your king. And so to all of us, let us ensure that we have embraced the gospel of peace. And so, dear sinner, let us wake up from any hopeful dream that a life of sin shall not find judgment from God. And let us all wake up to the reality of grace found in the gospel, that we have indeed embraced, again, the terms of peace. As someone once said, and I conclude, ye sinners, seek his grace, whose wrath ye cannot bear. Fly to the shelter of his cross and find salvation there. May all of us indeed find refuge in the Lamb, away from the wrath of the Lamb. Amen.